The speech I want to give today is realising Ireland's growth potential, and I find it remarkable there's very little talked about what is the potential growth rate of the economy, and there seems to be very little appetite actually out there, particularly in the economics community, to try to hazard an opinion as to what the potential growth rate of our economy is going to be. And this has struck me as a very major absence from our debate. The fact that we're now on the cusp of a referendum that involves a structural balance that lots of people are talking about, but very few would appear understand it. In order to assess a structural balance and a structural deficit in that regard, one needs to know what the potential growth rate is. The reason you need to know that is that the difference between the deficit when it's broken down into a structural, the other component part is the cyclical, the cycle. And so to know whether you're outperforming or not in the cycle or you're lagging, one needs to have some estimate of some trend or potential growth rate in the words of the economics community. So it seems very remarkable gap that nobody is giving much thought, it would appear to me, to this issue. As Dahi said, my background at the ESRI in two tranches in the early 1990s and again at the start of the last decade from 2000 to 2005, I was involved in potential growth rate estimation, not just in the Irish context, but also in the European forecasting network, the called Euroframe. And there the logic of the potential growth rate for the Irish economy tended to be in the order of 4% per annum real growth rate, tended to be the rule of thumb that was used. I would argue that the potential growth rate for the Irish economy is not lower than that, which can often be seen as a surprising statement. I believe that the Irish economy is on the cusp of a very significant growth potential. And the reason that I believe this to be the case is in my current occupation as Director General of IBEC, and Dahi kindly mentioned that we have 7,500 members and room for more, if anybody wants to join. But the great breadth of IBEC is that it is by far the largest business organisation in the country. By a scalar, we are 2/3 of the business subscription market in Ireland, but also quite significant in a European context. For instance, we're the same size as the British CBI. And that's not because we're that so much more inefficient, it's because we actually have a huge breadth across this business community. We trade under 60 different brands actually, ranging from Small Firms Association, but also Irish Medical Devices, Pharmachem Ireland, Retail Ireland, Financial Services Ireland, and so on. But we're also at the workplace. And so dealing with where people are predicting what's going to happen in their businesses, if they're unfortunately in the 2009, 2008, 2009 era laying off people, we will see this first. We also see the confidence when they're into investment in terms of machinery and equipment. And since 2009, the business model has turned in the Irish economy. And again, clearly, that business model hadn't broken because it couldn't possibly have done what it has done in the last number of years, which is return an economy that's taken the shunt that Ireland has taken back to a position where it's marginally growing again. This would not have been predicted by anybody looking at what happened to the Irish economy in 2009. Yet looking at the business community, we could see that these trends were already evident and that the export performance had already turned a corner in the summer of 2009, where history now shows that Ireland was capturing market share quite significantly in 2009. So while our exports fell by 4%, the world economy trade had fallen by nearly 13%. That market share was being captured through 2010, which was a record year for exports, exceeding anything that went in the Celtic Tiger period. Last year, we also had a record year in exports, and it really amazes me that we have such hand-wringing on the predictions of a mere 3% growth in our exports for this year. In most other languages, 3% in a record year is prediction of another record year. But we seem to contrive to take a bad news story from that. So in this context, I want to just maybe give you some of the stylized opinion maybe not facts as yet, as to where I think the potential growth rate is going to go. But first of all, I suppose that I have a public platform. I just want to say unequivocally that the Irish business community endorses and supports the referendum treaty, because we see this as a precondition, really, for the potential growth rate in the economy to be delivered. I think it's a platform for stability, and without that stability, there'll be no confidence. And the other piece I want to stress about this is that the referendum relates to the public finances, and always a very significant component part of an economy, but it's not a constraint on the growth of an economy, where our economy at the moment is 80% dependent on non-government aspects of the economy. So you would think from the debate that this was a straitjacket on growth. It is not. It doesn't relate to 80% of the growth machine in Ireland. And that machine is actually proportionally rising, heading towards 85%. So therefore, one needs to look at what's going on in that other part of the economy. And this includes, obviously, the households, but significantly, it also includes the business community, which has been a platform. So the certainty, I think, that will provide is important for the economic backdrop. Over the as part of our discussions today, we can go across what has happened in the Irish economy. I don't want to really go there, other than to make an observation. And the observation, again, harks back to the 1990s. I was at the ESRI in the early part of the 1990s when the prediction was made that the Irish economy could actually grow at 4% per annum during the 1990s, to much consternation and quite a bit of controversy in our parliament and in the media at that time, as to how an organisation had lost the run of itself so wildly at that stage. Anyhow, history shows it was more than double that. So the naysayers will say, well, that can't be repeated again, because that, in the parlance of economists, was a beta convergence, in the sense that this was a poorer country catching up and converging on the rich. And so, yes, that certainly happened. Ireland moved, as we know, quite dramatically from being a convergence country in the late 1980s, set around 75% of the European average in terms of GDP, to being 133% today. Therefore, that convergence play is over and can't be repeated again, and so that should condition your optimism about the potential growth rate for an economy. However, I would argue that the correct analysis of this is that we have to accept that Ireland is a small, open regional economy of a very successful economic bloc. In fact, the most successful economic bloc in the globe, that is Europe. And so that our ambition should be to become the most prosperous region of that entity. And therefore, there is some hope on the convergence play. Ireland, at the moment, I'm told, lies outside the top 50 European regions in terms of output per capita. So an ambition there in terms of actually moving up in the regional economy, 130% of a member state as your basin of attraction obviously would suggest convergence may be over. But if you actually change the prism to take a look at a regional basis within this bloc, then you'll see that there are some stellar objectives out there to catch up with regions like the Ile-de-France at around 170, or if you want to be ultra ambitious and move towards the southeast of England, and particularly London, which is over 300% of the GDP. So there's plenty of room at the top if we want to set our ambitions to be there. And when you look at the Irish business community, I would argue that we should not just alone be ambitious, but be confident that we have the capacity and have already set in train a significant platform in which to achieve that ideal. For the past 2 years, IBEC has had a very successful event each November. It's our annual CEO conference, which was bringing CEOs and industry leaders from across the economy with the aim to address the immediate challenges that face the economy. But more crucially, was to actually present the scale of Irish business, the diversity of Irish business, the adjustments that are already taken place in 2010 and 2011, and the future plans for those industries. It is a remarkable story, and one that actually, I think, has very little resonance in the wider Irish community. And that is in the policy-making community as much as it is in the everyday workplace, school, and household, is that the Irish, for instance, some of the statistics around there are genuinely inspiring for an economy. most people know that Ireland is a platform for US, in particular US foreign direct investment, and again the statistics around that are remarkable in terms of the quantity of US, in terms of value of foreign direct investment, still, even today, exceeds US investment into the BRIC countries combined. Because it's 40 years and we're at the more expensive end of that investment now is the rationale. But the fact that a place as small as Ireland could be an attraction for this, the logic of it is something that we say but don't seem to understand. Ireland is part of Europe, and so they just happen to be in one part of Europe and one that is very conducive to business. But it's also incredibly conducive to indigenous multinationals. And again, these are often talked about, but somehow we fail to understand their full import. For 4.6 million people to have multinationals of the scale of CRH, Smurfit Kappa, Ryanair, Glendimplix, the Kerry Group, the Glanbias, these are just incredible, strong brands. So when you look at a statistic that doesn't much matter, but often will catch the eye, is that US employment in Ireland is circa 100,000 people. CRH's footprint in the United States is 60,000 people. Okay, one country, one company. So therefore, my cat is my dog if they both have four legs. I'm not saying that Ireland is America in that. What I'm saying is that the scale of the businesses that actually thrive out of Ireland are a huge potential source of flow of incomes into the Irish economy over time. And in fact, if you look at the stock of foreign direct investment, it is equal to the stock of outward direct investment, give or take. And again, we're not blind to the fact that we still remain a small economy in a global world. What it indicates is the globalization of Ireland and its openness for business provides an opportunity and a platform that frankly other regions would certainly die for in the capacity to have a strong potential growth rate. In that regard, the issues is that is Ireland then just a platform for business, or does this have a spillover effects? And spillover effects, I think, are quite significant because, again, when you look at the income flows from the Irish economy, and we had the household budget survey data in the last 2 weeks, the most remarkable fact from that, I think, which will surprise people, is that Irish households have 42,000 euros disposable income after they pay their taxes. Some who choose to, some who don't in current debate. That the Irish households, on average, have 42,000 euros of disposable income. And if we look at the national accounts, it's slightly higher than that. Again, with 1.6 million households, Irish households their disposable income is in the order of about 90 billion. So when you look at the potential growth rate of the economy, again, not alone do we have a very scaled business that's disproportionate to the size of the economy, we also have households who, in any comparable measure at a member state level, are among not just the richest in Europe, but actually then by extension among the richest in the world. And so a very significant proportion of our capacity to realize our potential growth rate actually lies with Irish households and their decisions in terms of how they save and the manner in which their savings ultimately translate into either consumption or investment. So again, standing back from this, there's huge grounds for optimism that not alone will Ireland grow on the back of this, but actually will have has a capacity for a disproportionate amount of growth relative to other regions. So taking the metric, as I said, that we should be looking to the fact that we have a lot of headroom, I just want to get somewhat more technical on the topic at hand, raising Ireland's growth potential. There are plenty of estimates for countries' potential growth rates, but given the shock, the kind of structural break, if you like, that has occurred across developed countries during the 2008 crisis into 2009 and 10, a lot of people are shying away from making an assessment of a country's potential growth rate. In essence, there are two ways that macroeconomists look to potential growth rates. One is that they look at a trend and extrapolate that trend outwards in a kind of a trend smoothing and use various techno-babble speak around it. Things like Kalman filter or Hodrick-Prescott filter. And so people's eyes glaze over, and that lets you get away with murder. You just basically pick a number out of the back pocket, throw a few shapes around it, and away you go. The more interesting way to actually do it, though, is to go back to first principles and say that the potential growth rate in the economy is actually a production function. And so the production function approach, where you actually gather up the component parts in the economy, the quality of the labor, the nature of the capital stock, the machinery and equipment effectively, the infrastructure, and I suppose the X factor, the kind of total factor productivity, or in other words, the ignorance of economists that can't actually measure the bit that seems to be the synergy between these things, is probably a more sensible way to approach the potential growth rate in the economy. And so as you look to those particular stocks, again, I would contend that we should have quite a lot of confidence that we have the right type of conditions for very strong growth. When you look at the capital stock and what's happening across the businesses that we look at, it is remarkable in the last 3 years the extent to which the moving up the value chain that everybody banged on about for quite some time has actually been delivered very dramatically during these last 3 years, both by necessity and the capacity for people to adapt and to move quickly through it. And we see that in a lot of our businesses that actually have become more capital deepened. Consequence of that, unfortunately, is obviously the labour intensity of the growth is less, but that doesn't mean that's an inevitability through time. Because what you're experiencing then in this phenomenon is intensive growth. In other words, the skill of the labour and the technological advance is an intensive growth phenomenon. But in addition to that, during the early part of the Celtic Tiger, we also had this extensive growth, which is the actual volume of the labour and the volume of the capital. And again, if you just stand back, you will see in terms of the capital, in terms of the foreign direct investment and the reinvestment by the multinational firms into their brands. And I'm hoping to be in Middleton the weekend after next to sample some of the Jemieson's doubling of their capacity down in Middleton as one example of what's going on in companies, is that you're seeing that this extensive growth is also something that is very imminently achievable in the Irish economy. You've got the capital piece coming. We all know that the infrastructure, particularly around roads, which we tend to hark on about quite a bit, is certainly has a capacity to change the dynamic in business in terms of just-in-time delivery and so on, and that certainly hasn't reached its plateau yet. Companies are reacting to that motorway infrastructure in very kind of interesting ways, again, that we see the changing work patterns, the change capacity, kind of a Walmart effect is going on in Ireland in terms of that capacity of logistics and just-in-time. It's now long talked about, but now actually is feasibly delivered in our country. But we also have other infrastructural requirements around water, broadband and so on that still give us plenty of potential growth capacity if we manage to tap it correctly. And then take a look at the labour component. Again, the tragedy of the unemployment has to be tempered by the fact that the quality of our unemployment, the quality of the people who are currently unemployed and their capacity to be redeveloped quickly into new sectors should be grounds of optimism. Economists are sterile in their conversations and refer to this as putty or clay. Clay can't be changed into anything, putty can be changed into it. The Irish labour market, in those very unflattering terms, are putty. We do not have the same structural unemployment problems in terms of the quality of the people, I would contend, than in many other jurisdictions. Unfortunately, as time progresses, that will become more significant a problem, so therefore the need for us to have confidence and actually have a dash for sustainable growth, I think, is important. The ESRI in modelling the recovery scenarios in the OECD, drawing on some of these production function approaches, have ranged from, in OECD, from a potential growth rate of around 3%, which was double their post-crisis estimate for the Eurozone of 1.4%, but the ESRI have two scenarios, a high growth scenario where they're looking at a potential growth rate of around 3.8% and then down to 3% after about a 10-year window. In their low growth scenario, they have a 10-year average rate of about 2.7%. When you look at this, is that if you got a 7% growth rate like we did during the during the 1990s, in that 10-year window, the economy grows by more than 100%, about 110%, I think, on that occasion. In other words, it doubles. And, your debt to GDP ratio changes very dramatically in a 10-year context in those terms. And again, we need to think back of where we've been, is that the Irish national debt pretty much was untouched in terms of the top of the line during the Celtic Tiger period, that we didn't really pay off debts, but we saw that the debt dynamics was that by the end of the Celtic Tiger, back in 2007, 2008, we had a fairly low gross debt to GDP ratio in the 20%. That was all delivered by the denominator, by the growth rate. And again, that growth rate is actually in money terms. So when people are talking about a 4% or a 3% potential growth rate, they're talking about real growth, real volume growth in terms of goods and services. Add in inflation into that, which typically is in the order, in these scenarios, of a 2% over the long term. You're actually talking about, in value terms, a 4% potential growth rate, 2% inflation. You're talking about a 6% nominal increase in that deflator, which has the capacity to basically half the ratio of debt to GDP, all other things being equal in a near decade. And so it's against that backdrop that this potential growth rate is a very important pursuit to actually to spell that out. Conscious of time, Dahi, am I okay? All right. I'm all over my speech, by the way, so I don't know what's it's not even I've been following it in sequence. So why am I so confident about this in terms of certainly do the techno-babble piece of it, which is a lot of hand-waving with lots of terms in it, or actually looking at what real businesses and real people are doing in the Irish economy right now to give that kind of source of confidence. And one of the things I would say, having the platform here, is that I'm amazed at how the economics community in Ireland have detached themselves from the real economy during this crisis. I can see why people are concerned about the financial issues and the public finance issues, which are financial, and the money piece of it, crucial, important. But it appears to me to be the absence of a connection into what's really happening in terms of the businesses and what's really happening in terms of the capacity of the economy. And I hope that today, and I hope that IBEC can fulfill some of that missing gap, is that the scale of business, I think, is widely underappreciated by the vast majority of commentators. And it is somewhat bemusing to see that the international commentators seem to talk much more significantly now about the potential growth rate in the Irish economy, the real economy, than many domestic commentators. And again, that is possibly understandable given the scale of the financial crisis that we have lived through. Our export base, though, I think is something that really needs to be highlighted. The phenomenal export piece is obviously one issue, but there's also major global brands based in here. And again, in the European markets, we find that 15 of the top 25 global medical technology firms are here. But more interestingly, half of the medical device companies are actually indigenous. So Ireland is seen, if you want to take one sector to which Ireland is absolutely disproportionate now in its global reach, it's in medical devices. And again, within that thriving sector, over half of the companies involved in that are indigenous companies, side by side with the multinationals. And again, they're scaling up, and we see in terms of the employment intensity that they're also manufacturing. That's one of the big issues, again, that's not been talked about in Ireland. Manufacturing is coming back into the mix. So we now have a competitiveness gain over the last number of years where we're seeing that manufacturing is also coming as part of it. Again, I mentioned some of those major brands that are here, and if you match those with the US and European multinationals, and now some Asian brands beginning to arrive in it, you really have a hub within Europe that is a hotspot for business. And I think that's something that we need to be very conscious of in our commentary and comments about the Irish economy. That yes, you can have many negative comments, and that's fair enough, but I think it's important that we acknowledge the scale and potential that the business model that we have here has to deliver real, prosperous outcomes for Irish people. The competitiveness has been acknowledged, but I think the impact of it is probably missed again domestically. It is forecast that by 2013, Irish unit labour costs will have fallen by 14% from their 2008 peak. So for many of our major trading partners, they're seeing increases in their unit labour costs, and this is improving our relative position. So for example, relative to Germany, Ireland has already achieved a 17% improvement in labour cost competitiveness. These are the reasons and the factors why we're seeing manufacturing coming back into the mix. Again, Germany will be the biggest competitor in the medical devices space. One of the lasting impacts of the crisis obviously was that unemployment piece, but again, we have a relatively young and well-educated population, and this still remains so. You know, people kind of think this must have changed because we're banging on about that in the 1980s, and surely these guys have aged. Unfortunately, intensively we have. Extensively, however, our base is broadening, and our baby boomers are having babies, and having babies very significantly. And again, Ireland has the highest birth rate in Europe, according to the latest statistics from the CSO. The birth rate is 17 per 1,000, and that is up from 2000, when it was 14.4%. Okay, society can have no better statement of its own confidence in its future than its population dynamics. Ireland's by far the highest. It is still relatively young. It's the highest percentage in Europe of 0 to 14-year-olds in the total population at 31.7%, where the European average is 23.3%. And the median age of the population in Ireland is 34.7 years compared to the EU average of 40.9. In the skilled capacity, 1 in 3 of all 25 to 34-year-olds have a third level qualification. This compared to, that's in Europe. In the Irish case, the figure is 46%. So again, not alone that we have extensive, but we have the capacity for an intensive growth piece on the back of the quality of our people. So approximately 40% of those who are unemployed currently hold a post-primary qualification. And again, through the OECD, it was noted that unemployed construction workers, which are always a very significant cohort here in the last few years, were reallocated to other sectors of the economy, would yield productivity level gain of 1.5 to 2.5%. Right? The history of construction during the Celtic Tiger boom was that it was a very extensive growth in these terms that I keep using, but it certainly didn't have any intensive growth at all. In fact, it had negative intensive growth. Okay, so the statistics show in labour productivity that the volume of output in construction was only exceeded by the volume of workers that were going in there, so that the output per worker was actually negative. This is a remarkable feat in itself. But again, that is conditions for why, even during that period where we thought the convergence was being driven on, now that the tide has gone out there, that the actual sectors in the economy which were highly productive, even during the crisis period and during the last piece of the Celtic Tiger, were moving on and moving up that value chain and weren't broken, did not break during this period. And so when they had the added competitive advantage, we see that they've actually slayed the opposition by the fact that our market share has just increased very dramatically and our exports are at record levels. As part of our work, we looked at our members and we looked across what was out there. Like, for instance, the Citibank Commission report that said Dublin is ranked top globally as having the best human capital in the world. That's just come out. In terms of location, Ireland has returned to the forefront as an attractive location by the World Bank statistics of being 9th out of 183 countries, or 4th in Europe for ease of doing business. But when we were looking around our CEO conference, along with PwC, we did a major piece of research on Irish firms' investment and employment plans up to 2016. Now, this research was taken during September and October as the Eurozone crisis continued to undermine the international economy and was playing very heavily on the confidence of many of our members. Nevertheless, it is an extremely positive picture on the how firms saw themselves developing over the next 5 years. Despite the clear weakness in the domestic economy, businesses expect to see their turnover grow by 5% this year in 2012, and over 1/3 of the firms expected to hire new staff in 2012. And on average, the number of people employed by businesses is expected to grow by 2% of those businesses that were in place. And so, looking out to 2016, businesses expect to see an average turnover growth of about 7% annually, but more interestingly, in terms of their investment, 44% of them saw that their export sales will grow by, that those who reported that they thought their export sales would actually grow by 44%, and domestic sales increased by 22%. And crucially, all of the jobs lost during the recession outside of construction would be regained in the coming 5 years. We're well on our way to that type of phenomenon. As you look at again, is the notion that nothing has happened, that we've only had job loss in the Irish economy. We have a huge job churning going on during this phase, and the CSO have brought out those statistics in recent times. We see in the order of 300,000 jobs have actually been actually created during this phase. Unfortunately, more have been lost. But we must look to see that the dynamic that's going on in the economy is quite phenomenal still in terms of the regeneration. Output capacity is still well below its potential output. The capacity utilization of the economy is still at 75%, which is low by historical standards and in comparison to the capacity which European businesses are currently operating at. So again, the firms that are here and trading successfully have quite significant spare capacity. However, that clearly depends on where you're looked to. Those who are exposed to the domestic sector have obviously lower capacity utilization, while export businesses are operating much closer to full capacity. So overall, it provides kind of a positive indicator for the potential growth of the economy because firms are operating below capacity, but they're retaining the machinery and equipment to substantially increase their output in the coming years. Even though we see a lot of success, there's still a lot more to come, either through breaking into new export markets or a recovery from domestic demand. McKinsey have just brought out a report in the last, I'm not sure actually, I've only seen it in the last 24 hours, but I think it's been out a little while. Fergal, our chief economist, can fill us in later. But looking at this deleveraging story, and again, given the significance of the household, people say that in this deleveraging world that we're living in, we can't realize this potential growth rate. Again, they've pointed out that even in a world of deleveraging, growth capacities can be delivered that may surprise. There are some conditions required. Obviously, a stable banking system, a credible plan for long-term financial sustainability, structural reforms, rising exports and rising private investment, and a stabilization, crucially, in the housing market, and that involves transactions, not necessarily house builds. But anybody that's looking at the Irish economy in terms of the build at the moment will clearly see we're storing up huge capacity problems in a very short space of time. And again, from the businesses that we interact with already in the commercial property sector in Dublin, we're seeing incredible crunching going on in the quality of property that's required to fulfill a lot of this investment. So, two related points then, Dinah, clearly just want to finish up to get into some Q&A, is that while there is a high level of household indebtedness, not all households are indebted. And indeed, one of the features that we've been looking at in IBEC along with our members over last summer is that Ireland's indebtedness is actually very concentrated in particular cohorts. And secondly, again, now that McKinsey, the private sector debt burden is overstated in international comparisons due to Ireland's demographic challenge. A lot of this revolves around changing the default positions for the various groups. But one of the areas that is crucial for this economy is property. It was part of the issues in terms of the dive into it. But again, as everybody has given up on the potential growth rate and put their hands over their eyes or over their ears or whatever, they don't want to acknowledge this, is that we have an issue on our property market that is actually potentially dragged to the realization of the potential growth rate. So that one of the features that we will need to see in unlocking in terms of confidence in the economy involves the property sector, ensuring that we get an effective trading property, not just for commercial purposes, and as I said, I think that is going to be very soon a big factor for a lot of our businesses, but also in terms of the confidence that it gives for this expanding population that we have, as household formation has been postponed for a significant period of time. To finish up, I believe that there is tremendous growth potential in the Irish economy. We've been doing some work on it. The scale of it, in our view, is certainly twice the European average as a de minimis. The European average is a very unspectacular 1%. But it may indeed stretch to me even double that again to the 4% that was attained in the 1990s. This is, yes, it is wishful thinking, but I think it's wishful thinking on the basis of conditions that are very ripe to be fulfilled. And so I think the Irish business community remain extremely confident that we can deliver this potential growth rate. Despite the domestic problems we have, Ireland is relatively unique in the exposure of our exports is that Ireland can grow on exports. That's very unique in the world, but it's indicative of a small, open, regional economy. And therefore, in setting the bar high, and acknowledges that the government has set quite a strong bar in trying to make Ireland the best small country in which to do business globally, and we will encourage them along their way on that because it gives conditions. But it must be for something else. And for the something else is to make Ireland one of the most prosperous regions within Europe. And currently, if we're in around the 50 mark, there is plenty of potential room on a globalized economy in which to move up there. Dublin, obviously, is a disproportionate piece of the Irish economy even now, and is likely to have turned the corner even now when you look at some of the factors at play. But what we need is not an intensive growth story for our capital city, although that, in my view, is a precursor for a wider and more extensive growth across the country, is that we now need to start to deliver on our potential by, first of all, acknowledging that it's not just about the government and it's not just about banking, that the actual real economy and the Irish economy is much broader and much wider. It's deeper than most Irish people realise, and much more diversified. Any of those companies I said aren't all in the food and drink. They range from travel to gaming to construction to Smurfit Kappa with cardboard boxes and so on. So I think that it is easy to point to our debt levels as well and become disheartened. But if the economy grows at an average real rate of just 2%, and 2% for a nominal growth over the medium term, then it would only take Ireland until 2029 to get its debt level back to 60% of GDP. And that sounds like an awfully long time away, but just reverse the clock back in the other direction. It isn't that far at all. It's a very imminently achievable, and anybody will concede that our potential growth rate is at least 2% in volume terms. You double that, in my view, again, very achievable, and then it'll take us about 7.5 years to achieve that same feat. So this is within reach. It's not just out of our grasp, it's certainly within reach. So recognizing the challenges, I believe that we should take confidence. I think Irish business already demonstrates capacity to meet these challenges and flourish. And I think we just need the rest of the economy to join into that story and believe it. Thank you.